I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest today is Hudson Senior Fellow and Director of the Keystone Defense Initiative, Rebeccah Heinrichs. In this conversation, we focus on the topic of strategic deterrence, its components, and how that broad policy objective fits into the war in Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific region, and American domestic defense industrial base capacity.
The United States was like, oh, look, this is great. Everybody's really happy with the world in which the United States is the preeminent power, in which NATO is secure and we're going to do trade and we're all going to get rich and we're all just going to be, Jeffersonian Democrats and it's going to be wonderful. What happened was China just bided its time. It hid its hand, bid its time, invested, it got rich, and as it got rich, it never stopped being Leninist Marxist. They took the wealth on the backs of the American system of capitalism and free trade and invested it in a military specifically designed to push the United States out of the Pacific. They want to break up the United States' extended deterrent that we provide, our nuclear umbrella, to the Japanese and the South Koreans, and they want control over that region so that they can project power globally and unseat the United States, the world that we grew up in and that we want to maintain for our kids.
Hope you all enjoy this conversation. See you soon. Rebeccah Heinrichs, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. So you're a senior fellow at Hudson and the director of the Keystone Defense Initiative. Can you just introduce the initiative's work and the framing it's bringing to the policy picture?
Sure. So one of the things that I perceived as a gap in public education geared towards policymakers or your generally well-informed, wants to be even more informed American citizen is this idea of, how does the United States project power in the world, and what are the weapon systems we use, what are the theories and policies we use to deter major power conflict. So we're not talking about serious, but not as existential or as disastrous as like a terrorist attack would be. Very, very bad, but not something that could actually change the United States as the preeminent global power. So looking at that, and so I thought, I need to find some way to inject more of these good arguments, going back to basics, explaining why these things matter. And so the Keystone Defense Initiative was this idea that I can pull across the think tank world, look for great scholarship where people are making really critical arguments to this effect and aggregate them, get them out to policymakers, ask people to solicit writing on a particular issue. For instance, this subject of, what is provocative versus what is escalatory? Is escalatory necessarily the worst thing if you're trying to win the war? These concepts that they've got meaning that many people are using incorrectly. And so Keystone Defense Initiative is trying to get after that piece of the public understanding and education and discourse.
Two definitions I want to focus on are your invocations of provocative and escalatory, because especially in the post-op after Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of critics of U.S. foreign policy, right and left, have argued that various actions of the United States were provocative. And you're already seeing, in terms of Taiwan and the broader alliances the United States is forming in the Indo-Pacific region, a lot of people online make references to bases, provocative, escalatory. So just kind of unpack these terms in the context of the debates we're seeing today.
Oh, this is like my favorite subject. We could spend the whole next hour talking about this. So you start with what does the United States want to happen? Okay, so as you think about once deterrence failed with Russia and Ukraine, Russia invades Ukraine, we saw it was our interest then to have the war end quickly, to have the Ukrainians stop the Russians from sacking Kyiv, and for Ukraine to succeed in some fashion, by some definition, depending on kind of what's going on the ground. And immediately, you saw some people who didn't support America's efforts to defend Ukraine assert that everything that the United States did to support Ukraine would be escalatory or provocative, provoking the Russians. In fact, the Democrats, this is typically something that progressive national security people make, an argument that they make, that the United States acting too strong or our allies acting too strong can provoke or elicit a response out of our adversary when they just want to be left alone. We know that's not the case with the Russians. The Ukrainians did not have a lot of weaponry necessary to get the Russians out of their territory. And so it was that weakness, that vulnerability that ended up provoking the Russians to go ahead and attack Ukraine. In fact, Congress had approved of a foreign military sale of a significant weapons package in addition to what the Trump administration had provided for Ukraine. The Biden administration was holding that back because they were trying to strike a deal with the Russians. That's at least what was reported, not confirmed by the administration publicly. And so it's not strength if what you're trying to do is defend and deter aggression. You're actually trying to prevent that aggression. And if you have vulnerability, sometimes that leaves an opening that can tempt and provoke an adversary to act aggressively. And then real briefly on this matter of escalation, once the adversary has attacked and deterrence has failed, then the question is, how do the good guys, how do the Ukrainians escalate sufficiently to steer the Russians to say, okay, this isn't going to work. We should either negotiate or we should get out of here. It's not going to work. If the defending nation does not escalate sufficiently, then you have a long protracted war of attrition like we're seeing now. If, of course, the Ukrainians escalate too much, then you can elicit a response where the Russians say, oh, my regime is at risk, whatever that attack might be. I don't see the Ukrainians even having that ability to do that. And then they might have a response that the United States doesn't want to have, for instance, a nuclear attack against a NATO ally or something like that. But escalation in and of itself is not bad if you're the country defending yourself. You have to escalate sufficiently to convince the adversary that he is not going to prevail with the current course.
Something I'm really interested in is your articulation of a quicker victory, a shorter war, because it seems like one of the results of the United States not having an active military presence in the war in Ukraine, once again, something I support, has been that it is not up to us to define victory conditions. So there's a world where the United States defined victory as, wow, we repelled Kyiv. They didn't take the, country in 3 or 4 days. Yes, they took more territory in eastern Ukraine, but end of the day, we saw Putin's speeches. We saw his writing on the subject. Victory is the success of Ukraine as the modern nation state. That is not Vladimir Zelensky's definition of victory. And there's going to be a gap in the ability to win or the length of a conflict between those two different definitions of victory. So how should we, as non-active combatants, think about that dynamic?
Couple of things. I mean, one, obviously, there's so many factors. And so the first mark of a serious person who's actually grappling and not just demagoguing this issue is that they admit that this is very hard. You have to have some humility and say, and there's a lot of people's opinions who have a say in this, like you rightly pointed out. You've got Zelensky's opinion, you've got Putin's opinion, you have Eastern European capitals' opinions, you have Western European opinions. So there's a lot of people who have a lot at stake, different degrees of what's at stake, and different degrees of risk-taking that people are willing to put on the line. I do think, though, that the United States as the coalescing force for NATO. So when I say coalescing force, when we stick with supporting Ukraine, you have other countries who are willing to stick with Ukraine. You've got some countries like the Eastern Europeans, the Baltic countries, and Poland who are willing to even do a lot more, but it's still the United States who kind of has to give a thumbs up or thumbs down because we're the ones that have control a lot of that technology, et cetera, because they were our weapons that we sold to them. So we really are the leaders of this conflict. Whether or not you want Joe Biden to be the leader, I mean, the United States is essentially, just by the fact that we have the most power and influence on what's happening in NATO support, that we are the ones who are leading. So we do have say we do have a significant degree of ability to input into Kyiv, to input into Zelensky, and if done well, and if statecraft was exercised prudently and well, I could conceive of a scenario in which we may privately, as Americans, have some kind of scenario that we would say that is a win for us as an American perspective. So what does Rebeccah Heinrichs think? I would be pretty happy, realistically, if I try to squeeze and say like, okay, what I think is realistic that I would be satisfied with as an American, it would be pre-February 2022 borders. So, and it would be a strong Ukraine now that has a full and robust ability to hold the line there, defend itself. And you have Eastern Europe with replenished stocks, much stronger, probably a stronger American presence in Eastern Europe, move some American troops out of Germany because the front of NATO is now in the East. It's not over there. And that would enable Europe to be strong, protected, and get us to a position of peace. Now, that's not perfect because I want Crimea to be back in the hands of Ukraine. But is that something that I, as an American, would be okay with in the short term if it's what gets us back to where we were February 2022? I mean, maybe. Is that something that the Ukrainians are going to be satisfied with? Absolutely not. Is that something but I think that might be the one way for Russia to say, okay, we're going to end this because this can't go on forever. And now we're looking for artillery from the North Koreans. That's how bad things are for Russia. However, I think for statesmen, for American leaders, you don't have to say that. You don't have to publicly be going out and saying Ukraine needs to give up Crimea. You can be saying, your public argument can be, there's going to be a lot of moving parts. The United States is going to have an active role in getting us to a position of peace. Privately, you can have those discussions with the Ukrainians. And furthermore, you can equip the Ukrainians with the ability to take Crimea so that the Russians understand that they might lose Crimea if they don't talk. So, there's deal making that needs to be had. And so one of my frustrations is these candidates who are running for higher office are getting too specific and in the weeds about, what the United States should or shouldn't do. It's like, you don't need to be doing any of that. You haven't had these classified briefings. You don't know what's going on. What you can say is, we want to end the war on terms most favorable to the American people, to European security, and that is best for Ukraine as well. And you can kind of leave it at that, and you kind of get in there, you're going to see that there's going to have to be some hard decisions made. But I think that is realistically the direction we should be going. Of course, it's not what Joe Biden has decided to do. He's kind of kept this war open-ended and has said as long as it takes, without fully equipping Ukraine to make battlefield successes, which is going to be necessary if you're going to try to convince the Russians to talk.
Yeah, I'm glad you ended on that point because I think it gets to the difficulty of the public versus private dynamic you just articulated. So from my perspective as a supporter of aid to Ukraine, I think a critical critique of the status quo that skeptics I think are completely valid in raising is just we're asking a lot materially of the American people at a baseline level. What is unclear to them then is what is the final objective? How long does it go? So you just said that you're going too far if you're explicitly stating we're going to say this specific thing or that specific thing on the campaign trail too, especially. But how do you balance then both reasonable expectations with, at the end of the day, this is also not something you could just gamify with op-eds?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I've advised people to be saying, to say is a long, protracted war of attrition is unacceptable. And so you equip Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield. We must. And that is how you get to anything that looks like a conclusion to the war that is favorable to the people who were unjustly invaded, Ukraine. I mean, if we can end this war in a way where you kind of look at the scenario, NATO is stronger. Ukraine, not a member of NATO, but Ukraine is now going to have one of the strongest, best, most well-equipped and well-practiced militaries in all of Europe. They're going to be able to provide the United States with so much. I mean, they're going to end up, right now, they're the students in a lot of ways. They're also the teachers in a lot of ways. We're learning so much for how they fight the Russians, how they can adapt. And so they're fighting corruption. I mean, people who are worried about corruption in Ukraine, one of the remarkable effects of this war has been there's so much scrutiny on Ukraine right now that they're going to be so equipped to demonstrate how you fight corruption and have accountability and demonstrate that of maybe some other Eastern European countries who are members of NATO now. I mean, you have all these things where Ukraine could end up a strong sovereign nation with strong national identity that's a great contributor to the West. But you can be making all of those arguments and say, but I don't know how it's going to specifically end. What I do know is a long, open-ended, protracted war in which we're not actually equipping Ukraine to prevail. That is a loser. And that is an expensive loser. It's also immoral. We're not going to fight the last Ukrainian. That is a terrible way to equip an ally who's being invaded by one of your top-tier adversaries.
So I'm not asking you to do psychoanalysis, but I am very curious because your articulation of this isn't an open-ended war, this isn't this long-term open commitment, that actually is a response to, I think, once again, one of the stronger critiques coming from skeptics of the left and the right when they're coming to the Ukraine policy. Why has the Biden administration not been more direct about this not being open-ended? Because at a pure political basis, it doesn't actually, it's the most vulnerable argument that's actually going on here.
Well, a couple of things are going on. So I was very familiar with Joe Biden's policy views on foreign policy long before he was vice president and president, because he has had a strong interest in foreign affairs as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. And in the course of my work on matters of arms control and disarmament and deterrence, he is notoriously comes from a school of thought that is more risk averse and has great skepticism in the utility and the usefulness of going towards hard power as a means to coerce your adversary and to compel things in a way that is towards American interests. I mean, calling him a pacifist isn't unfair, but he comes from that wing of dovishness and risk aversion. He is still that man. I mean, he's very risk averse. I think arguments that certain actions would be provocative are persuasive to him. And so, for instance, in the beginning of the war, the Hill, I heard from members' offices, Republicans and Democrats, understood that the United States would not provide Ukraine with real-time intelligence, that it was on a delay, because they didn't want the Russians to be able to credibly say that we were a co-belligerent, a co-combatant in this. And so they were just concerned that the Russians then would strike out against us. I mean, we're the ones, we are not. We are only supporting a country being invaded. That's a perfect example of something that would be very persuasive for Joe Biden. Or then, don't give them longer range strike systems, because then what if the Ukrainians do too well and it upsets the Russians? Or, what if we can't provide them ATACMS because they can actually hit Crimea? You're going to have to equip the Ukrainians to do the things that the Russians don't want them to do in order to get the Russians to look for an off-ramp. So I really think that they are plagued with this indecision, risk aversion, and unwillingness to really be courageous and enable the Ukrainians to actually seize the advantage and be the ones who are controlling escalation rather than ceding escalation to the Russians.
Yeah, and speaking of deterrence and risk, if we began this podcast by discussing ways the United States can deter its adversaries, it's pretty clear that nuclear brinksmanship is clearly the way that our adversaries are working to deter us. So I guess the question for you is, how should policymakers navigate a dynamic where, at a minimum, separate from whether or not the Russians would actually use nuclear weapons, tactical or otherwise, where at a minimum you will have the Russian government, Russian aligned figures, Russian sympathetic figures, threatened with the use of a nuclear weapon? Like, how do you because it's, and this also comes into a potential Taiwan crisis, because my perception, as an observer, has just been the first thing, the CCP would do if there's any potential Taiwan conflict is call every single Wall Street tech industry outside person and say, hey, this is happening right now. careful, we may do it. Because as we saw with Crimea and Ukraine, that's been an incredibly effective tactic. So how do we think about this dynamic as a policymaker, separate from whether or not this would purely actually happen in the real world?
So this is a great question. One of my continued concerns about the way President Biden and his officials, it's quieted down because the Russians have quieted down their rhetoric about with nuclear threats, but it was really bad, in my view, in the beginning of the conflict, where President Biden essentially gave oxygen to these nuclear threats. So the Russians just, I mean, the American people are now attuned to Russian nuclear threats. The Russians make nuclear threats with some frequency.
They should probably take away Medvedev's Twitter account, because I'm being entirely serious. I think he legitimately took it to such a beyond parody extreme that I think it actually just helped everyone calm a little bit down. So
amazingly, this is how they always are. I mean, what Twitter does is enables the rest of the American people to kind of see how they talk. But they issue incredibly, I would say irresponsible, but irresponsible is not the right word, very inappropriate nuclear threats. I mean, when the Bush administration wanted to put missile defense systems in Europe, Poland, and the associated radar in Czech Republic, the Russians threatened nuclear attack against that. When the Obama administration said, okay, we're not going to do long-range interceptors in Europe, let's do shorter-range interceptors, but let's still put missile defense in Europe. These are defensive systems, defensive. They work when you shoot missiles at them. So they're not going to shoot missiles at you. And the Russians threatened nuclear. I mean, it was implied, heavily implied, various Russian officials. So this is what they do. Now, cannot assume they're always bluffing. That would be very irresponsible for American strategists whose responsibility it is to make sure deterrence does hold to the best of our ability. So what do? I mean, I think I have taken the Russian nuclear threats seriously. But the answer is not to very publicly say, so we're not going to do these things because the Russians have threatened us with nuclear weapons. You do not say that, because all you do is you increase the value of Russian nuclear threats. You can see that they have coerced the United States. They have deterred the United States from doing things that we would otherwise like to do for the Ukrainians. And so that, to me, I mean, President Biden, remember that he got caught with that Democrat fundraiser. Somebody videotaped it. And he was talking about Armageddon and World War III, but he wasn't trying to scare the Russians that if they use a nuclear weapon, the United States will make them regret that. That's the correct response. When the Russians threaten nuclear employment, you say, if you do that, I'm not going to tell you what we'll do, but I promise you will regret it, and you should not do it. You should not step down that path. Instead, President Biden spent his time scaring the American people. You know, we're scared of World War III, scared of Armageddon. And then what that did is it made us okay with having a very small and limited response and dripping support to Ukraine. That's exactly the wrong. And to your great point, it does matter to other adversaries are looking at this. I mean, what have the Chinese learned about the value of threatening nuclear employment against the United States or our allies if we want to come to the aid of Taiwan? And I mean, you would think that they're going to threaten that very early in a conflict because it has had the effect of really frightening the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's just the difficult part to really think with. So just to really sum up this part of the conversation, because I actually think this has been just like the number one issue, but it's defined both sides of the debate here. Your answer to the potential of a nuclear saber rattle is just deterrence, where we basically started the conversation.
It is. So let me give you just some more specifics, because when I say, people will then think like, oh, Rebeccah, this is too aggressive and you're warmongering. No. First of all, there are things worse than war. Subjugation, for instance. So you have to understand what the value of a thing is. First of all, you have that clear in your mind. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States is willing to put in U.S. forces for every potential conflict with aggressors all over the world. I have never argued that we should. But in this particular case, where you have Ukraine, not a member of NATO, but certainly Russia has made it clear that they're trying to break up NATO. They would like the United States and our influence, power, and leverage over Europe to be gone. And so Ukraine is the first part of it, the first aspect of it. And so we want to stay away from the nuclear precipice as far away as we can. So we want to end the war in Ukraine before it gets anywhere near threats of horizontal escalation into a NATO country. So yes, so my response is if I believe any nuclear employment anywhere in Ukraine, obviously a NATO country, that would just trigger Article 5. But if the Russians think that they're going to get us to stop by using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, crossing that nuclear threshold, I do believe that the United States should have the view that Kennedy had, really, during the Cold War, which is a nuclear employment anywhere. That is a response in which the United States must respond, because it's such a game changer and it has such enormous effects that we don't want to normalize nuclear use in conflict, like what chemical weapons really have essentially. Chemical weapons are banned, but Assad still uses them. We do not want to live in a world in which that's what's happening with nuclear employment, even on the lower yields of detonation. So I do believe that the United States should turn to the Russians and should say any nuclear employment anywhere, even in a place in which there's no people, and you're using it, that would elicit a response that I promise you would regret. And what are those things? And they can get into more specificity with the Russians and what they want to imply or threat. And I don't think they should take anything off the table, including American nuclear retaliation. I think that you can keep that vague. But yes, the answer is you convince the adversary. You at least inject enough doubt in his mind that he will succeed with his political and military aims, so that he decides, okay, we're not going to do that. Not today. and then things are moving and they're dynamic, but you definitely don't want to imply that he could do that and get what he wants. Because that is only going to encourage more of those kinds of threats.
I think the next question, and this gets to, frankly, the anniversary of 9/11 that happened earlier the week that we recorded this episode. But what broadly are we trying to deter? Because as I interview policymakers and individuals across the ideological spectrum, it really seems like we have a broader problem, which is that we've lost just the language and the conceptual understanding of what deterrence is in the first place. So can you just really start by articulating that from a baseline?
Definitely. So whenever I talk to people whose primary work is thinking about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons or counter-proliferation or strategic deterrence, I've now begun to think, let's just define our terms so that we are talking about the same thing. Because even in this, highly specialized field, people can still use terminology very differently. You saw this actually with Congressman Mike Gallagher asking Biden officials after Russia invaded Ukraine, and he asked them if integrated deterrence succeeded, because the Biden administration is now talking about integrated deterrence, that deterrence is not just threats of hard power, that it includes shaping the adversary's calculations, threats of economic pain, telegraphing what their moves are going to be before they move so that we rally ally support, et cetera. And that will somehow deter them from doing things they otherwise want to do. And we're going to call it integrated deterrence. And Mike Gallagher asked them, he said, so did integrated deterrence work? And they said it did. And he said, but Russia still invaded Ukraine. And they didn't really have an answer for that. They tried all these other things, but it didn't work. Okay, so what are we talking about here? What I use the term deterrence, small d deterrence, as just a noun, is you're trying to convince your adversary that whatever he wants to do, which would go against your own interests, whatever the degree of how serious those interests are to you, that he will not succeed, and so he should not do it. That you can it's going to be punishment that the United States is going to inflict on him if he does it, or we're going to prevent it from happening and then inflict punishment on him. But whatever it is, he's not going to succeed. Clearly that failed in Ukraine. So when I talk about, though, deterrence broadly, but I do believe strategic deterrence has still held. Russia has not crossed the nuclear threshold. Russia has not crossed into a NATO country that would require the United States to be going directly at war with Russia. And so that so far.
And a key thing is they've clearly reduced their ambitions within Ukraine itself as well, too, to that point.
Yes. And so that has been a win. And there's a piece that needs to be written about that too, because we do need to learn from what has happened. So I might be very critical of the Biden administration's failure to truly, lean into strategic deterrence and communicate the right things and signal the right things. But there's also a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, clearly. And I think there's also just, the United States still just has a reputation that goes beyond and bigger than the president himself. But whatever those other variables are, strategic deterrence has still held. And that's to a great credit of what I believe is so important and critical to what makes the United States a unique country in the world and makes us the preeminent power is our nuclear force, our strategic nuclear force. And so when I say, what am I trying to deter from strategic deterrence? Major power war, things that would trigger the United States to get into a major war with a country that has the ability to harm the United States such that it is a major defeat, enormous loss of American life, undermines the United States to be a sovereign nation and to live the American life as we see it, democratic republic, free and sovereign, et cetera. So it's their ability to actually take their authoritarian form of government and put it on us such that we are no longer recognizable as Americans. And really the only two countries that have the ability to do that are Russia and China. And China much more than Russia because of all the tools they have in their toolbox. But their nuclear forces are what gives them that ability to inflict that kind of damage against the United States and threaten the United States for what we want to do in the world. That makes us so free, powerful, and prosperous.
And I think this goes to your definition of deterrence and broader American objectives. But can you just talk on a not quite personal level, but the shift from the war on terror era where the United States is clearly on the offensive, for good or for ill, we are the ones who are initiating contact. We're now in an era where we are the status quo power. And I think in many ways that actually should be to our advantage, in the sense that you kind of, whenever you see, Chinese propagandists on Twitter saying things like, look how the U.S. is being so provocative. It's like the very obvious response is, okay, then just don't invade Taiwan. It's because once again, like we, it's like, we're not trying to, launch attacks on Hainan Island. We're just sitting here. It seems nice how all this trade is going on. Just don't do it. So talk about just like the shift from an era where we are forward facing to when at the end of the day, we and our allies are just maintaining a status or trying to maintain a peaceful status quo.
Absolutely. So this gets to the heart of why I actually was very impressed with a lot of the things that the Trump administration did and still believe that those policies are sound. And whoever the next administration is, I think it tends to be the party of Reagan, because we really need to go back to how the Reagan administration thought about major power deterrence and preventing wars that could have catastrophic outcomes. And so it's more in the DNA of the Republican Party to think this way, but part of this is you have to have a very clear vision of who our major adversaries are. How are we going to successfully deter them, which requires us to think about what their goals are so that we thwart those. And then we have to come up with a strategy and resource the weapon systems to carry out that strategy. Since the Cold War, right as I was born, we're ending the Cold War. Ronald Reagan's giving his SDI speech. We're coming to the end of it. Really going into the early 90s, the United States sat at the top of its power in terms of its influence, the size of its military. Our economy was doing great. And so we that picture of Gorbachev and Reagan and and Bush 41, standing there looking at, you had this image of this very hopeful future in the United States sitting at the top. That was what we think about as the United States is now leading an architecture of democratic open societies. We're the strongest ones. We can influence things in the world on our own terms. And we had a military that could defend what we mean by free and open Indo-Pacific and all these other sorts of things. we squandered that as a nation, Republicans and Democrats, over the last 4 decades. And when I say that, people are like, what do you mean? We have a $700 billion plus defense budget and $800 billion plus defense budget and broaching the $1 trillion mark if we really need to do what we need to do now. And to which I say, yeah, we spend a lot of our money on good military systems, and the United States and our engineers are really good at making weapon systems, but we did not invest in a Navy that was determined to protect American preeminence. We did not. Our Navy is, I don't know what the size of our fleet is now relative to what it was at the height of the Cold War. It's tiny. And the Chinese have now surpassed that in terms of numbers numerically of ships, if not by tonnage. But what I blame on this, we focused on the war on terror, which I'm all about going, you need to break up ISIS and Al-Qaeda, et cetera. But our entire focus, the weapon systems we invested in, et cetera, were all to fight these long wars, do counterterrorism. And Bush 43 made the same mistake. If you read his remarks about Russia, he would say that Russia is no longer a threat. And we've turned a page. That part of history in which major power war could happen is behind us. Of course, Obama famously did this. And so we did not invest in the size of the Navy we needed. We did not invest in the space systems we needed. Though we're good at it, we did not act like we were defending our preeminence like our life depended on it. We did not invest in the nuclear enterprise that we need, which is the keystone of our defense to project power abroad and protect our interests. We have a totally atrophying nuclear enterprise. Our labs are literally falling apart. We can't produce the nuclear warheads at the scale we need in order to successfully deter our adversaries, which now we have 2 peer nuclear adversaries. And so we just had this 4 decades of thinking that if we just do trade with China, that they won't be communists and threaten us. If we just do trade and just talk about Russia reset, that they won't actually want to attack NATO. But there's so much more that goes into a country's calculations. And so, I decided I wanted to pursue national security and defense because I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. But I knew that the big problem was not going to be terrorism. It's really bad. Islamist radicalism, serious. We got to keep an eye on it. It's going to be, oh my goodness, we are asleep at the wheel as a country. And we've these progressive ideas about how, the world is just sort of evolving and becoming, evolving out of this idea that we're going to go to war with major powers and we can just sort of cede our sovereignty to international institutions. It's deadly. And that we need to get back to these Cold War ideas about investing in our defense and national security so that we can carry a big stick. And then you can engage in negotiations with people. But we've lost that big stick. And we really, goodness, we could talk about how our military industrial base has just atrophied because we really believed that trade was going to keep peace. But you have to have a strong military that provides for the security so that you can have global trade. And we really have missed that piece over the last 4 decades.
I think the key thing, and that's why I want listeners, especially in the policymaking community, to focus on the status quo part of the conversation, is that I'm going to critique the post 9/11 era as someone who was in 4th grade during 9/11. So I'm going to limit, I'm going to amplify my self-awareness there. It seems that there was a lack of recognition of how dedicated Russia and China specifically, Iran in a different Middle Eastern context, would be to upending that status quo. Because if at the end of the day, you're going to have disagreements between, the George W. Bush administration and Vladimir Putin, or the same thing with the Chinese. But at the end of the day, if they are still committed to the overall status quo, you could work through that. Part of the reason why the Hainan Island incident in 2001 is rectified, I think, to the benefit of everyone, why it's a incident that's been long forgotten by, I think, most people, even in the policymaking communities, because at the end of the day, China was okay, or at least presenting as okay with the status quo. So that's the critical shift. And it just seems that when it comes to the defense industrial base issues, when it comes to the Navy, when it comes to the overall force structure, and even the ability to articulate what America's foreign policy objectives are, policymakers and political actors were just not ready for that shift away from everyone being okay with the overall structure.
The reason that China was okay with a world in which the United States insisted upon certain behaviors in trade, in commerce. You pay royalties on things whenever you buy them, that there's intellectual property rights that must be respected between nations, that transparency is a part of being a responsible actor when we do trade and commerce. China was happy to accommodate all of those things because it didn't have the military to punch us in the mouth and say no. And so it was quiet for years as it rose. As its economy grew, the United States was like, oh, look, this is great. Everybody's really happy with the world in which the United States is the preeminent power, in which NATO is secure, and we're going to do trade, and we're all going to get rich, and we're all just going to be, Jeffersonian Democrats, and it's going to be wonderful. And I mean, I'm overstating it only a little bit, really. What happened was China just bided its time. It hid its hand, bid its time, invested, it got rich, and as it got rich, it never stopped being Leninist Marxist. And certainly Xi Jinping is a committed Marxist himself, though a modern one that fits China today. And so as China got wealthy, they took the wealth on the backs of the American system of capitalism and free trade and invested it in a military specifically designed to push the United States out of the Pacific. The reason that China was not, using water cannons against the Philippines several years ago, but they are now, because what is the United States going to do about it now? They get stronger, they start becoming more provocative and more aggressive. And then now you're seeing the North Koreans act even bolder because China is feeling stronger. And so Kim Jong-un thinks that he's got daddy Xi Jinping who can provide cover for him. So Kim leaves North Korea and goes to make deals for arms with the Russians. And when Kim's gone, North Korea still tests missiles. That's remarkable that that he is running his country so brazenly against what the United States keeps telling North Korea not to do. And so that's what's going on here. The United States, people were satisfied with the status quo when the United States was willing to enforce it, when we could enforce it, when we had the confidence in ourselves, in our ability to use strength to threaten, when we had a strong economy where we could wield sanctions effectively. And so that's really what's changed. China did get rich, but they didn't become a liberal society. Instead, they became the world's most sophisticated techno-authoritarian state with a Chinese Communist Party deeply, deeply dedicated to Xi Jinping and Marxist-Leninist concepts. And so now you're seeing them, now they have the ability, they want to push the United States out of their region. They want to break up the United States' extended deterrent that we provide, our nuclear umbrella, to the Japanese and the South Koreans. And they want control over that region so that they can project power globally and unseat the United States, the world that we grew up in and that we want to maintain for our kids.
As someone who follows the debates, especially on the right, about what America can or can't do in the world and whether or not it's a positive influence, the immediate response that I think the more skeptical side would raise to what you just said is, Rebeccah, we're not in the world that we grew up in. It's not the 90s, the defense base rotted, and that's not coming back. Critics often bring up the fact that it's not 1941. We could talk about arsenal democracy all we want, but that was a fundamentally different America. So I guess the real question here, and this has implications beyond just foreign policy, at the end of the day, what is America capable of today from your perspective?
So I tell people, it's like things are really bad. Things can always get worse. And anytime the United States has done really great, remarkable things, it's because they were in a really tight spot. And so we have agency. We are not doomed to decline. There are a lot of things we could go on about, things that are concerning to me with our institutions, confidence in our institutions, rule of law, cultural decline in ways that I think are very bad for the American ethos and what makes us Americans uniquely and gives us this can-do optimism. I mean, there's a lot of pessimism in the air, and I hear it and I know it. I'm not blind to that. I can read the room, but we have agency, and things are dynamic. And so the answer is, well, okay, so what do we do? So when I say the defense industrial base, I'm talking about, do we have the most basic ability to manufacture not just the weapon systems themselves, but the component parts that we need to actually quickly, timely build the kinds of weapons that we need at the scale we need to deter a major power conflict, and then to win if deterrence fails. We are not anywhere there. We need more shipyards for more ships. But the answer is you build the shipyards. You have to understand that this is a national imperative. We have to move with a sense of purpose. We do have all kinds of serious and profound debate to be had domestically about the direction of the country, but we're not going to be able to have any of those conversations about free speech and the weaponization of the Department of Justice, et cetera, if the Chinese Communist Party has its thumb over us as a nation, that they have a stronger ability to direct and affect American prosperity because they can close us off to one of the major areas for trade through the Pacific. Or, they're collaborating with the Russians against the United States. So if they back the Russians to break up NATO, I mean, that's an area of major economic prosperity and peace for the United States and the American people. And so, the answer is not to look at how bad things are and say it's just too hard. The answer is you look at how bad things are and say we got to roll up our sleeves and get to it. Somebody has to come along, many somebodies, not just in government but in the private sector, that says I'm going to take short-term losses to do things that are good for the American people in my country. In the case of like businessmen who have been unwilling to criticize China because they still want access to Chinese capital. But it's going to ruin the country, our country, if China continues to get this leverage over us to the point where they have enormous leverage over how international trade and behavior between and among nations actually plays out. So I say, yes, it is very hard. And it's going to take some serious prioritization. We've been deferring decisions as a country about investing in our nuclear enterprise, more shipyards to produce more hulls. I mean, we've got lots of things, more bombers. I mean, we've got the new B-21 bomber who's going to come online, the air leg of the nuclear triad. We're expected to have about 100 and some of those. I think we probably need double. But that means we need more hangars, another production line. And these are all decisions that we got to make now because it does take some time to do it. But we can do it. It'll help the American economy, get Americans to work, but that's not why primarily you do it. You do it because you got to protect our vital interests. And an American-led world in which we're the strongest power is still so much better than a world in which the country that's trying to take that from us, the Chinese, are the ones that have the strongest ability to do the most harm and affect world events.
As you articulated, and Representative Gallagher effectively illustrated, it's pretty straightforward to tell the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as like a failure of deterrence. We're not going to go back in time, obviously. And there's a whole other podcast we could do about like the play-by-play, before, February 2022. But for the sake of this podcast, most policymakers listening are thinking to themselves, okay, the next deterrence question is how do we deter a conflict over Taiwan or in the broader Indo-Pacific? So what would just be your takeaways for someone who's focused very specifically on that broad set of questions?
We have to get firepower into the region now. So this gets back to where we started with like, well, isn't that provocative? No, the Chinese are at a breakneck pace to changing the status quo by their provocative behavior around the Japanese, using water cannons against peaceful Filipino fishermen, Vietnam. And so they're just acting aggressively, rejecting norms that the United States has, with our allies, have said is normal, responsible behavior. And so what the United States must do now is quickly, yes, we arm Taiwan, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. You arm Taiwan, but we need to be getting, Guam needs to be fully defended and ready to be able to be a forward basing for the United States to project power closer into the region. I mean, we should be making sure that we have the ability to refuel aircraft effectively, and that we have the ability to fuel our warships effectively. This is where the defense industrial base comes into play too. Obviously, moving towards that, it's going to look like we're getting on a war footing because we want to convince the adversary not that we do not want a war. We want to defend the peaceful status quo that we inherited from the Cold War. And so to get there, we have to convince them that they're not going to succeed if they go down this path. Real quick, just on this issue with is Ukraine dragging us down further, though, so that we can't handle China? I mean, I will say another one of the surprising things, because it's so hard to get policymakers and the bureaucracy to move to change from the way it has been acting and behaving. The Ukraine war has actually lit a fire under a lot of companies, a lot of Democrats who don't want to invest in the Department of Defense, to say, oh my goodness, we have got to do this faster. And so they've actually moved the timeline up for the United States to say, we need to replenish our stocks. A lot of the weapons that we're sending to Ukraine, they would not be weapons that we would be using in the Indo-Pacific either. However, we are ramping up production of these things that we can replenish stocks in Eastern Europe, our allies, so they can hold the line once this war is behind us. It's also just rebooting supply chains for things that we do need for weapon systems when we do want to deploy Tomahawks, et cetera, into the Pacific theater. So it's on net. It is having a positive effect to get the country to make these hard decisions that we need to do. But we have to have somebody in office who can seize the moment, realize what's happening. I mean, these defense companies are not going to hire people unless there's a political demand signal that we're going to be producing these weapons at scale that is necessary to deter conflict in the Pacific. And so let's hire lots of people, and let's start building the infrastructure to produce the necessary weapons. And then the last point I would just say, and this is where the Biden administration if you could say, are they doing anything well? On this point, they are, which is increasing collaboration with our allies in the Pacific, like the Philippines, Vietnam, so that Japan, although, it's not just the United States that's doing this, it's their leaders and their capitals that have been reaching out because they see what's going on with Russia and Europe. And they're scared, and they see how provocative China has become in the region, in the Pacific region. But greater basing access, greater relationships, information sharing so that we can pull resources. That's all good, but now you got to get combat power in there. You actually have to get the ability to threaten the Chinese with military force so that we don't actually have to employ it. And we should be doing all of that very, very quickly. I'm afraid that the Chinese are going to see that there's this window where the United States is still sort of flat-footed and hasn't invested in the capabilities that we need, so that they might actually move to do something really terrible, like take Taiwan, which would be devastating for the United States' role in the Pacific and our ability to. It's not just about semiconductors. We want the United States to be the preeminent power in the region, to have free and open access to trade. And if China takes Taiwan, that would give them an incredible advantage from geography, from a military perspective, strategic perspective. It would cause great doubt in Japan and South Korea that we could actually fulfill our commitments from a nuclear assurance perspective if China takes Taiwan. And so it's so much more than just semiconductors. It's critical that the United States make sure that we can keep Taiwan a democratic nation and free from military invasion from the Chinese.
And I'll just editorialize for a second, because you said two things that trigger very serious feelings for me. In reverse order, yes, I think there's a strategic political communications error going on with a lot of the semiconductors discourse, in the senses, like, what have we been discussing in this conversation? We've talked about nuclear conflict. We've talked about the deaths of thousands, hundreds of thousands of potentially millions of people in like the worst case scenarios. If that is all about semiconductors, my take is that the American people will basically say, and once again, this is oversimplifying it, but okay, I'll wait another year for my next iPhone. Reducing the entirety of the Indo-Pacific region and the serious debates to semiconductor manufacturing. It's a very important component, to kind of like use that word, but I actually think people need to be very, 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 very careful from that, because the logical culmination of one of two things: either one, we do a pie in the sky, not serious effort to get them back by some magic date. Two, we basically say it's not worth risking nuclear conflict over, once again, iPhones and the next Ford Bronco that I'm going to want next year. I really get frustrated when I think proponents who agree with us on these broad topics overemphasize that part, because I don't think it leads where they wanted to lead. And then number two, and this is a key thing you made about how the American response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is at least at a minimum gotten us serious and like engaged with these topics. I fail to see a world, because you see a lot of the Asia firsters basically say like it was a mistake to focus on Ukraine, this or that. There is just no world where I think we would have had the energy and the focus we had if Kyiv had fallen quickly, if Russia had just dominated, especially once again 6 months after the withdrawal from Kabul. The very exciting thing, and this is why I try to keep this podcast as nonpartisan as possible. You've done a good job on this, but I have center-left Democratic friends who for the first time are engaged and interested on these issues because they see things like, wow, like the war in Ukraine is completely different than the war in Iraq and debates about the war in Afghanistan in the 2010s. It's bad if we can't manufacture things. How do we focus on that? That is only happening in a Taiwan context because of our policy in Europe. So I just get so frustrated. I'm like, how was that going to happen? How would Ukraine have fallen? And then we magically are like, but now we're serious. There just seems to be a real gap of understanding. If you reduce these things purely to, well, how many things could we produce this week or that week, you miss the political aspect of this.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and first of all, we're not robots, we're people, and those are people who live in Taiwan. And so to talk about them, as though this is commodity, it's just semiconductors, first of all, it's gross. It's terrible if you are a public official or a public person talking about a people in a nation. I'll use the word nation when talking about Taiwan. That way, you really do a disservice to yourself for being somebody who's going to be able to communicate and persuade other countries who you want to side with the United States also. So there's this soft power part of that I think is a big, just huge mistake to communicate that way, to view a people that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the semiconductor piece is very important. And so losing the semiconductors because of an invasion would cause a global recession, probably depression. I've heard worse than anything the world has seen that would last 3 to 5 years. Really terrible. To me, though, that's still a drop in the bucket than the end of the US-led world order, which is what I do believe that is what we're looking at if China takes Taiwan. Taiwan being a democracy, something that the United States has invested in enormous, not just semiconductors, but just trade in general, seeing those people flourish. It's important to the CCP to take Taiwan because they want to show that, the supreme way to live and be is this, ethnically pure, Han Chinese living in a Marxist-Leninist society. And you see that Taiwan, and they're like, no, actually, we're fine, thanks. We're fine living the way we want as a democratic society. We're happy, we have freedom here and individual liberties, and we don't want to be Chinese communists in the form that China is today. And so there's lots of other implications for simply just treating Taiwan like it's just a commodity because of semiconductors. One thing that I just think is just remarkable is we see countries like Lithuania, small Baltic nation in Eastern Europe, and they have said no to Chinese investment Belt and Road because they don't want to be communists, and that's part of China's deal whenever they do Belt and Road is they say that you have to at least be soft and compliant with Chinese characteristics in the way we run our government, and it is compliant with Marxist-Leninism. And the Lithuanians said, absolutely not. We've done the whole communism thing, the fascist thing against our will, and we don't want to have any part of that. And so the Lithuanians then turn around and invest heavily into Taiwan. So you can see that Eastern Europe is making the connection with Taiwan. Taiwan has solidarity with the Baltic nations who are under the threat and the shadow of Putinism, authoritarianism from Russia. And so, in realism, to be realistic means you have to account for the long memories, the strategic cultures, the principles, the systems of government, and how these peoples and these capitals are going to respond when the United States does or doesn't do something. And so clearly, we want to have a coalition of countries like Japan and South Korea and the Australians, the UK with AUKUS, helping the United States keep the Indo-Pacific free and open, and our European allies, of course, in NATO, helping us to maintain the U.S.-led order through the major mechanism has been NATO. And we talked a lot in the past about how, countries have not done a great job of investing in their own security over the years. We're not the only the only Western capital who has been asleep at the switch in terms of defending ourselves and preparing for the worst case scenario. But now they are. Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was like when Russia was amassing hundreds of thousands of forces on the border of Ukraine, you still had people saying they're not going to do it. It's a bluff. It was remarkable. They were still living in like global world, war on terror world, where they thought that the biggest threat to Western countries was Islamism, and it couldn't possibly be a major nuclear power. Well, guess what? They are. It is. And so that shocked a lot of people. Still, it's frustrating as, somebody like me who understands that this is a relatively anarchic world and full of people who are making decisions that are self-interested, and we never evolved as a human race above the use of force as a tool to get our own way. I mean, what matters is you have to have the people who have just societies, relatively speaking, we're not perfect, with the greatest power and the ability to wield it well with those other countries that agree with us that sovereign nations should not be invaded and be coerced and compelled under the threat of force to be authoritarian like the countries that are expansionist. And so anyway, so I get really frustrated when I see people talking about a people and a society in a country like Taiwan as though they're just good for us economically. It's just a stupid argument anyway. It's shallow. You can see the second and third order effects of thinking about people in that way. And again, we're not robots, we're people. And if China takes Taiwan, the consequences will be so much worse than losing semiconductors for a few years.
And my actual closing statement here is to make the whole American-led world order post-World War II more tangible to folks. That is a world where nuclear proliferation is limited, and those states with nuclear weapons do not use those nuclear weapons as a coercive means of achieving territorial and national gains. If you are a person who's concerned about the use of nuclear weapons per the start of our conversation, a world where the United States reduces its foreign policy to, hey, Taiwan is 2028. We got to 51.2% of our manufacturing capacity in Arizona. Therefore, you guys are left behind. That is a world where you see nuclear proliferation, a lack of faith in American commitments, and once again, a world where that risk of danger, just by definition, is going to go up. So I think it's very important that these things be tied together. Rebeccah, this has been really great. We actually went longer than we've typically gone on Arsenal of Democracy, but I think this is just so pressing that it's well worth it. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks so much. It was fun.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.